Hello and Guru Scott. This is part 3 of our Stillen Supercharger video on my 2011 Nissan Xterra. So where we left off was we replaced the fuel pump, and what I've done since then is I've actually driven the vehicle, took it down and filled it up with high octane fuel, so it'll be all ready for when we do get the supercharger installed and ready to go. So that's all working fine. So now I'm going back to the very beginning of the manual where it says to take this blue plastic piece and cut it down to 1/4 inch in length. This is a special tool they provided. So I'm going to do that. And then also it says to take off the hood. I'm not going to do the hood yet. I did mark it. I'll show you that here in a few minutes. I marked around it with a marker so I know the relative position of it. So when I do take it off, I can hopefully put it back on pretty easy. But for right now, I'm going to not take it off, and I'm going to do all the work without taking it off until the very end, because I want to make sure the thing runs, and then I'll worry about taking the hood off and doing the grinding on it. All right, so I'm going to get the tool ready and then we'll come back. So at this point we're ready to go ahead and start the actual mechanical disassembly. I did reconnect the battery from after we did the fuel pump. I'm going to go ahead and disconnect this, and I'm going to get underneath and remove the splash plate, as they call it, underneath the front here, and then I'm going to drain the radiator as per their request in the manual. So I'll get all that done and then we'll come right back. Here's the splash pan we took off. To get it off, there's a couple of hidden screws up in the front, like underneath, but there's holes that they have so you can get to them with either a screwdriver, or in our case we used a 10mm socket on an extension to get to this one and this one here. Then of course you remove these 4 here, and then there's 2 back here, and then it just pops out and comes loose. These are for your access when you're changing the oil filter and changing the oil. You use this access port, so you can just leave that as it is. So we've taken this off, we've drained the radiator fluid, and now we're going to move to the next step. So I'm going to check that out and I'll be right back. Before I move on to the next part, I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about on this Nissan plastic radiator. It has a plastic drain stop. It takes a Phillips screwdriver to take it out, and it's got a little rubber washer on there. And I put some Krytox grease on that rubber washer, and I'm going to reinsert this now. And it only gets a very low torque setting, something like 7 to 9 inch-pounds, just barely enough to snug it up and not make it too tight. So don't over tighten it, else it might snap. Also, you might want to go ahead and go down to Nissan and get a couple of gallons of blue long life antifreeze. We know at least 2 gallons came out. We don't know how much is going to go back in yet because we have to measure it all out when we're done with this whole assembly. But for right now I've got 2 gallons, and so I have that all ready to go. So I'm going to move to the next step here in just a second. Next thing we're going to do is take off this engine cover right here, this decorative panel. You take out these 2 10mm bolts, and then if I remember correctly, it just unsnaps. It has some rubber snaps it goes into. So we're going to check that out, and if I'm wrong, I'll come back and let you know. All right, so at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to take this tube off here by disconnecting or loosening all of these hose clamps here and over here. We're going to take this mass airflow sensor connector loose, and it's got a little piece that holds it here to the air box. We're going to take the air box out, and it says to watch out for some bolts on the inner fender. And I don't know if they mean from the inside the wheel well or from this side here. I see there's some bolts down here I can get to through by using some obstruction wrenches. So we'll get all this loose, and if there's any weird issues, I'll come back and tell you about it. Otherwise, should be pretty straightforward. So we'll get that done, and then we'll check out what's next. Your next step is going to be to remove this bracket here. And so there's a couple of bolts here to take it loose. I think that's going to be it as far as bolts. But before you take it off, you're going to want to disconnect this vacuum line where it goes behind the throttle body here. And then over here, you're going to want to disconnect this electrical connector. And you're going to want to disconnect this purge valve assembly. So we're going to disconnect it back here. It doesn't really give clear direction, but we're going to keep the whole assembly intact. So if we need to reattach these parts, that won't be any problem at all. It'll just make it easy to get out of the way. So we're going to do that, and then we will show you what's next. So at this point, we're ready to start making some disconnections, and We're going to be disconnecting a lot of the electrical stuff in here. It's all listed out in the manual as to what to do. So we'll get all that electrical stuff done, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to figure out the next step, which I think is going to be to take this intake manifold off. But before we get to that point, we'll get all the electrical stuff done and then come back and I'll describe what we did. So at this point, what we've done is disconnected a lot of wiring harnesses. What we did was we disconnected the throttle body wiring harness, the power steering sensor, the Vias control solenoid, driver's side cam adjuster, the driver's side injector connectors, and the rearmost coil connector. And there's 2 grounds at the top we disconnected, put the bolt back in so we wouldn't lose it. The fuel injector bridge connector on the back of the intake manifold bracket over there. And we also disconnected these hoses, these cooling lines that go here. And it says to take some of these clips off and you won't reuse them. We'll go ahead and take them loose and we'll figure out what we're going to do about that. Because it says there's a small plastic clip and these are large plastic clips. So I'm not sure what small plastic clip they were referring to. So we'll get to that though when we do. So that's where we are now, and it looks like we're ready to move to the next step. So here we go. So at this point we have pulled off the intake plenum here. It had 7 bolts holding it down, actually 5 bolts and 2 nuts which went to studs which had to be removed. So I used my stud puller. It's made by PBT. It's an Australian company that makes these tools in Taiwan. They're really quite good. So made it short work to pull out the 2 studs. Did that. There was a bolt here with a giant washer on it. Took that out. So now we're ready to start moving on to the next part, which is going to be to take the fuel injector wires loose and to take the fuel rails out. So we'll do that and then we'll come back and talk about it. We didn't have any issues with anything related to following the instructions so far, except we had to look up a couple of terms on the internet to make sure that the items that we were taking wiring from was the correct nomenclature, because in the manual here it just tells you by the Nissan name and they don't have enough diagrams, in my opinion, to give you a full explanation. But it's easy enough to look stuff up on the internet. All right, so that's it. Right now we've disconnected this fuel line, and the way you do it is you take off this gray piece that clamps it down. You just pull it back, and then Stillen supplies you a tool that you've cut down. It's this one right here, and you actually put it underneath there over that first ridge, and you push up on it and it releases this, and then it sprays gasoline all over, but not really too much. Honestly, it just sprays a little bit. So now I'm finished with that tool, and this is disconnected, and I'll bag this so it's not smelling like fuel. And then I'm going to pull off the injector rails, and then we'll come back and talk about what's going to happen next. We've pulled the passenger and driver side fuel injector rails. They come out as one unit. You can see this crossover pipe here. On the new assembly, we're going to end up putting a crossover pipe in that's flexible. And so this is going to conclude part 3, because at this point we're going to move into the next part, which is extending the wires and then starting to change these parts over onto the new rails. So that's it for part 3. Thanks for watching. Tschüss.